Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar hosted by Petal on the way we play. The series of webinars that we're hosting this September are around the topic of play in the pandemic. I am Sara Baker. I am one of the principal investigators at Petal, and I'll be chairing today's webinar. Before we start, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. We are on Zoom conference, which, as some of you may have noticed, is a little bit different from your usual Zoom experience. As an attendee, you will be muted, so we will not be able to hear you, and your camera also will not be used. If you do have any questions, we invite you to share them using the Zoom Q&A interface, and we will try to respond to them during the Q&A period we will have after we hear from our speakers. We're going to be recording the webinar so that you can view it later or pass it on to people who couldn't attend live. Petal is hosting this series of webinars on play in the pandemic, and we are a research center at the University of Cambridge. We study play in education, development, and learning. We have three core aims at Petal. We aim to provide world-class research, we aim to build capacity in play research, and we also aim to influence policy and practice. If you'd like to know more about Petal, please do visit Petal Hub. You can see the link here. Why have we invited you for this series of webinars? Throughout September, we hope to show you different contexts of play in 2020 around the world. We are examining the state of play in the pandemic and how play can help to address inequality and how it can be used in challenging settings. We hope that through the seminar series, you can learn more about the many faces of play research and begin to get an idea of all of the exciting collaborations that are possible. Our first two webinars have already happened. They are online, and you can view them at the link here on this slide. This webinar will also be recorded and viewable at the same link. If you would like to find out more about Petal, please do email us. You can go to our website, or you can follow us on social media. There's a QR code on this slide as well, if you would like to use that to reach us. And now, what we all came here for, I would like to introduce our speakers. Today, we are delighted to host Professor Helen Dodd from the University of Reading and Professor Ana Qvortrup from the University of Southern Denmark. We're going to hear from Helen first. Helen has been contributing to the Play First campaign for schools to prioritize children's play. And she's going to tell us a little bit today about some of the work she's been doing around play in the pandemic. Then we're going to hear from Ana, who works in Denmark and will be telling us about some research she's done on the first phase of reopening following the earlier restrictions during the COVID pandemic. So what we're going to do is we'll hear from Helen first for 15 minutes, then we'll hear from Ana for 15 minutes, and finally we will have time for questions. So please, please, please save up all your questions, and we'll be really interested in having a chat at the end. Over to Helen.
Okay, great. Thanks for that introduction, Sarah. Hopefully you can all see my slides and hear me okay. Thank you to Petal for inviting me to present today. I'm hoping that we can use this as an opportunity for us all to stop and take a breath for a minute and reflect on how play has been relevant and has changed over the past 6 months. So what I'd like to do is take you through the past 6 months, beginning in March, and describe how play has been relevant to the pandemic at each stage, because I think it has changed across time. So let's go back 6 months and 1 day ago when the UK-wide lockdown began. Schools were closed and the majority of UK children are now home from school, except for, of course, the children of key workers who are still in school. And government guidance at that point is that we can only leave the house once a day for exercise. And it wasn't clear at that point whether that meant children were allowed out to play or not. I think lots of people assumed that exercise meant play for children, fortunately, and did make sure that their children were outside playing at least once a day. So one of the things that I was concerned about during this time is that suddenly everybody was talking about homeschool. Parents were under pressure to recreate school at home. So your child can no longer go to school, but they still need their education. So make home look like school. And this chart here shows the number of searches for homeschool across a year on Google. And you can see this spike around the time when we had lockdown in March. So suddenly everybody's talking about homeschool. All over social media there are homeschool timetables, and there's this pressure on parents to be schooling their children whilst also trying to do their own jobs and deal with the fact that we were facing a global pandemic. And I was really concerned about this. My sense was that that wasn't actually what children needed at that point in time, or what would be best for families and for children's mental health. So together with a colleague, Dr. Tim Gill, I wrote this piece for The Conversation about letting children play, the need for children's play, and how that would help parents and children to cope with this huge transition and this challenge that we were facing. The crux of the argument in that paper was that free play is really important for children and it offers a range of benefits. So we know free play, when children are allowed to play whatever they want to play, however they want to play it, they start and finish playing when it suits them, and adults only get involved if they're invited to be involved. So it's entirely child-led play. We know that that kind of play is enjoyable for children. It gives them an increased sense of control because they're deciding what to do, they're deciding when to do it. So it gives them a small area of their life where they feel in control, which is really important at a time when lots of us felt like we didn't have any control over what was happening. Free play also helps children make sense of things that are going on in the world around them. So it's a way for children to express how they're feeling and to understand what it is that's going on. It helps them express themselves, and it can also support that parent-child relationship. So if a child is allowed to play in a way that they want to play, that's led by them, and the adult is only coming in when they're invited to come in, that's a really nice way for supporting that relationship and for, joining your child in the context where they want you to join them rather than everything being led by the adult. So this important role of free play was what we wanted to be asking parents to prioritise and trying to take some of that pressure off, that it's not about recreating school at home, but it's about doing what's best for your child. And maybe what children needed at that point in time was just a bit of space and time to play freely. We know that free play from research is beneficial for children's well-being. So the studies showed that when hospitalised children are given time for free play, then their stress decreases. And also similar, when children are in hospital for treatment, they show lower levels of anxiety and fewer negative emotions if they take part in a play intervention. So this isn't all just soft, fuzzy, doesn't this all feel nice, let's let children play more, but there is scientific evidence to support allowing children opportunity to play freely, and that can reduce their stress when they are in challenging situations. So that was what we really wanted to promote at that point in time when we had just gone into lockdown. And it was really nice to see a little while later this article in The Guardian with Professor Paul Ramchandani, who of course is the director of PEDAL, completely on the same page, that what children need is not for home to turn into school, but they need opportunity to play and to learn through their play. So that's in March. We've just started lockdown. We're all going, what on earth's going on and how are we going to cope and how long are the children going to be home for? And then lockdown went on and it went on and it went on. So what did play actually look like during lockdown? I'm hoping that over the next couple of months there'll be more research coming out telling us about how lockdown did affect children's play. This data is from a study that was conducted by the University of Limerick. You can see the details at the bottom of the slide here. And what they found, they asked parents about children's play, and the children were aged between 1 and 10. And what they found was increases in screen time and increases in outdoor play in their sample of children. And interestingly, 1 in 3 children were reported to have brought the virus and or the restrictions, social distancing, only being allowed once a day, outside, that kind of thing, into their play, which I think is really interesting. And it really reflects that idea that when we allow children to play freely, they use their play to understand and make sense of what's happening in the world around them. So if that's correct, then we should expect to see that the things that are going on in the world around them are reflected in their play. So these 2 pictures here, these are my own children. This is a game that they spontaneously made up during lockdown, which is called Splat the Virus. So they've drawn on the pavement here using chalk some viruses. And it's a bit like hopscotch, and what you have to do is try and jump from one to the other and splat the virus. And the idea was, from their perspective, that they were kind of killing and defeating the virus as they were jumping on the splats. And I think this is a really nice example of how children might use play to gain a sense of control over what is a challenging situation. I'm really interested in this idea of how the virus and restrictions have come into children's play, and I'm about to launch a project in collaboration with colleagues at the Museum of English Rural Life, where we want to try and create a digital archive of memories from parents and from children about how they played during the pandemic. So that's something to look out for over the next week or 2. Hopefully we'll be launching that project and asking for people to offer their own perspectives on how children's play has integrated themes of the virus. So I've also been involved in a study called the Cospace study, and particularly I'm involved in the part of the study which is with parents of children who are aged 2 to 4, so preschool age children. And we asked some questions in this study of parents about how they play with their child, how confident they feel playing with their child, how easily they can keep their child occupied, and their stress about keeping their child occupied. And what we found, these are just some preliminary analyses that I've done in the last week or 2 for the purposes of this seminar, was that parents who said that they had a lot of ideas about different ways to play with their child were more likely to also feel like they could keep their child occupied. They were less worried about doing enough with their child, and they found keeping their child occupied less stressful. So this is really nice data, I think, about how important it is for parents to feel that they can play with their child, have ideas of how to play with their child, and then you get these kind of knock-on effects that parents are feeling less stressed, less worried, they can keep their child occupied. And so I think in terms of thinking about, if we were to face another lockdown, providing support to parents about different ways to play with their child and supporting that play and interaction might be really beneficial for helping parents to cope with what's going on. And interestingly, we also found that parents who felt stressed about keeping their child occupied had children who had higher levels of emotional and behavioural problems. So it may be that we need particularly to work with families where children have got higher levels of anxiety, for example, higher levels of inattention and behaviour problems, and particularly thinking, how do we support those parents to keep these children occupied and to have different activities and ways that they can play with their children. So then we fast forward in time a little bit and we start thinking about children going back to school, and there was lots of discussion about that it might look a bit like this, that children would be kept 2 meters apart, there'd be room for about 7 children in each classroom. And together with some other colleagues who work on children's mental health, we were really concerned that this wasn't what children needed. This wasn't in children's best interests. It was very much focused on controlling the virus rather than a balance between the risk of the virus and what children needed in terms of their social and emotional development and their mental health. So at that point, together with colleagues, we launched a campaign called the Play First campaign, where we wrote a letter to Gavin Williamson asking that when schools reopen, play is prioritised before the idea of kind of catching up on the education that they've missed. So we were arguing that children need an opportunity to play with their friends, to reconnect socially, to settle back into school before any pressure is put on them academically. And so this was covered in The Guardian, and we wrote various blogs and articles around this campaign as well. One of the questions that I faced when we were working on this campaign was the idea, well, haven't children been playing more than ever? All they've been doing is playing. School's been closed. Like, why should we be prioritising play? That makes no sense. And my answer to that is that yes, for a lot of children, including the data that we saw earlier, children were playing more, maybe more outdoor play, probably more play on screens. But what's important is that they weren't playing with their friends. And not every type of play is created equally. Children need an opportunity to play with their friends. They need social interaction. So what we were calling for was that children needed an opportunity to play with their friends, and that's prioritised when schools reopen. And also, I think it's important that we remember, for some children, there will likely be a deficit in outdoor active play. For children, for example, who live in a home where they don't have easy access to outdoor space, or live in a community where there isn't access to outdoor space, or they weren't able to use it safely. So that brings us to where we are now. What does play look like now schools are reopening? I think we're going to hear a little bit more about this in the following talk. These pictures are pictures that I found on Twitter from schools that I follow, and I wanted to share them with you to offer some hope. Schools have reopened and children are playing, and some schools are really offering a fantastic play experience. So it is possible. We shouldn't be using the virus as an excuse for controlling or decreasing the amount of time children are playing. And I think those recommendations that we wrote back in May for the Play First campaign still hold now. What children need is an opportunity to reconnect with their friends, to settle back into school, to express how they've been feeling, get some understanding of what's been going on for them over the past 6 months before they're under any academic pressure, to start to catch up on any education that they've missed. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much again, Pedal, for inviting me to speak to you today.
Thank you, Helen. Your passion for children's well-being is just brilliant to see. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. As I said earlier, we will have a Q&A at the end. So anybody who does have questions, please keep them in your head or write them down somewhere. And we will have time for that after we hear from Ana. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to do this talk. I will talk about not play, return from play as something that is anything other than or is in addition to teaching or learning, but and talk about playful learning in schools after the reopening. On March 11, the Danish Prime Minister announced that all schools were to close down and all pupils should stay home. On April the 15th, the schools were ordered to undertake controlled reopening for the youngest pupils, which mean that they have been home for five weeks. The older pupils followed 4 weeks later. So that's a shorter period of time than we heard before. They were welcomed into settings that met certain criteria in regard to physical and social restrictions in line with health and hygiene restrictions. A Danish study conducted in the middle of the school closure phase showed that the learning environment during the closure were very much characterized by being teacher-led and teacher-centered, and with a high degree of individual task solution. Furthermore, the study showed that the pupils were severely challenged in regard to their mental health and their social well-being. There's reason to assume that the pupils' social emotional experiences have turned to the positive again after the reopening. They're back in school, have resumed contact with friends and teachers, and are part of a learning environment that is greater to a greater extent than during the school closures, is similar to what they are used to. Furthermore, an analysis based on data from my project actually shows that the rules and regulations on outdoor activities and small groups of teachers have forced teachers to be creative. The average experience among the pupils is that 4 types of learning activities: project-oriented learning activities, guided discovery learning, inquiry learning and problem-based learning activities are more frequently part of teaching during reopening than before school closures. And actually, according to Parker and Thompson, these activities align with the ideas of playful learning environments. That is, according to Parker and Thompson, learning environments that provide an experience of learning as joyful and enhance learners' enthusiasm for teaching, enhance meaning, fosters pupils' social involvement and interaction, motivate and commit pupils to the processes of learning, and give pupils the opportunity to investigate and experiment with their learning processes. However, there's also reason to question whether the pupils' social and emotional experiences have turned to the positive. Although they're back in school, there are still social and physical regulations that place restrictions on the way of being together and socializing. And in general, they have been through these two phases of transformation that may have disturbed the habits and routines to such an extent that they do not feel comfortable in the learning environment. Thus, the question of my presentation is, what are the social and emotional experiences of the children who were challenged from the experiences during the lockdown and have been socially isolated as they're re-entering the learning environment? In my presentation, I've drawn data collected as part of the research project, A Window of Change, Transformation of Playful Learning Environments in Kindergarten and Primary School during and after COVID-19, funded by the LEGO Foundation. This project investigates the conditions for playful learning in kindergarten and primary school after the global outbreak of COVID-19. And it is based on a mixed method approach with surveys and interviews with children, parents, and teachers, and furthermore, classroom observations. When we in the project talk about social emotional experiences of schooling, we take a perspective of well-being that is not disease oriented. We suggest social emotional experiences to have a multifaceted nature, incorporating not only mental or emotional well-being, but also positive functioning socially and academically. Thus, we distinguish between emotional well-being, which we describe as a cluster of symptoms incorporating dimensions such as personal growth, purpose in life, realization of potential, self-acceptance, feelings of energy and joy, and specifically, of course, related to the COVID-19 situation, also fear related to illness and stress from the closure and reopening. As part of the social well-being, we incorporate symptoms such as the ability to adapt and respond to various situations appropriately, including the capacity to control one's emotions in order to engage effectively with one's environment, but also positive relations with others and autonomy. As part of the academic well-being, we incorporate symptoms such as the pupils' mindsets and attitudes towards their learning environments, but also their experience of having agency, a voice, and so on. It is well known that pupils perceive coping, that is the feeling of being able to master concrete situations and their self-efficacy, that is a broader belief in one's own abilities in relation to the level of and requirements of school and subjects, affects pupils' functioning. The location on the dotted line is chosen to illustrate a timeliness, you can say, to the way these influences takes place. Single experiences of lack of coping will not affect the dimensions of social and emotional experiences to any significant degree, but repeated experiences of lack of coping over a longer period will do so. And then to the results of the project. First of all, it proved useful to distinguish between the three dimensions of social and emotional experiences. A correlation analysis shows a strong significant correlation between the dimensions of social and emotional experiences. However, although they're significantly related to each other, differences in correlation suggest that there is reason to keep them analytically separate. In addition, they differ in how they are associated with other variables, and we will return to that. If we look at the percentage distribution of pupils on each of the dimensions of social and emotional experiences after reopening, both the emotional and social well-being look, compared to the picture before the reopening, surprisingly fine. The interviews supplement the quantitative picture by pointing out various reasons for that, this, and in fact, the great loss during the closures appears as one explanation for a good level of emotional well-being. One of the teachers says that it's great to experience how the kids come back and just really want to go to school, while another teacher describes the children's return to schoolwork as like sending the cows on grass in the spring. The teachers suggest that fears of the disease as a factor that have led to emotional stress, of course, but most of them actually experience that in some way they have gotten used to it. It was quickly become everyday for them. Quantitatively, the experience of being less happy about going to school after the reopening is negatively associated with social well-being. But as we heard from the interview quotes before, there's an experience among the teachers that the school closures has actually, maybe only for a short notice, but still led to a positive experience of going to school. This is also what we see in the quantitative data. Furthermore, a number of teachers point to zoning as an explanation for the high level of social well-being. Fewer conflicts are positively highlighted as a consequence of zoning, but the teachers also give the reasons that the pupil do not have to relate to so many people during a day. Furthermore, as the quote suggests, zoning seems to have strengthened class community. We have pupils who have blossomed because of it, since they have suddenly gotten something with the class that they had not before. Also, the teacher-pupil relationship is highlighted as an explanation. For me as a teacher, it has been a bit of an eye-opener, because I can feel that I have reached some children in this which I have not reached before. It should of course be clear that there are examples of the opposite, especially among the oldest pupils. We find pupils who feel limited in their social opportunities, and in general, the picture is a little more varied when it comes to social well-being than the emotional well-being. When it comes to academic well-being, the picture, as the picture here shows, is a little bit more mixed. There are no major differences between boys and girls, but in general, the level is lower than in the other two dimensions of social emotional experiences. And that's why I would choose in the last minutes to focus on this, what actually affects the academic well-being and what could we get from recommendations based on this. Actually, as you see here in the table, a bivariate analysis suggests that the pupils' experience of the 4 types of learning activities, the project-oriented learning activities, the guided discovery learning activities, the inquiry learning and problem-based learning activities, that they experience to be more frequently part of teaching during reopening than before school closures, actually positively influence the pupils' academic well-being. Other predictors of the pupils' academic well-being is contact with teachers and the feeling of engaging in a class community. But also difficulties complying with rules and restrictions due to COVID-19 and difficulties understanding why the rules and restrictions are important are significant predictors of academic well-being. So difficulties complying or being able to engage with the rules and restrictions, but also the understanding the reasons for not engaging is important aspects when the kids come back. Furthermore, perceived coping is actually a substantial predictor of expected academic well-being. Perceived coping, as I said in the beginning, is defined as the pupil's feeling of being able to master concrete situations. And of course, it's understandable if the pupils are affected by the many changes that have taken place, with first distance learning with a high degree of online resources, and then outdoor teaching in small groups. And then for the conclusion and the recommendations. In my presentation, I have suggested social emotional experiences to have this multifaceted nature, covering 3 dimensions of emotional well-being, social well-being, and academic well-being. The usefulness of distinguishing between these 3 dimensions can actually be illustrated not only in this project, but by comparing the conclusions of this project among students' well-being with the conclusions of the project about students' well-being during the school closures. Here the pupils were particularly challenged on their mental and social well-being. A generalized indicator of well-being would not have been able to show these differences between the two phases of closures and reopening, and thus it would be analytically inaccurate. Furthermore, it would not be of any help in practice, since it would not help deducing precise factors for designating efforts to get the students through the reopening. Furthermore, I have shown that which factors that in the Danish context has an effect on pupils' social and emotional experiences. First and foremost, I showed that playful learning activities positively influence the pupils' academic well-being. What we hear from several teachers in the interviews is that it can be important that the conditions related to the demands for, e.g., outdoor teaching in small groups are utilized, so that it is not just a recontextualization of the classroom teaching. Other factors are contact with teachers and class community, but also difficulties complying with rules and restrictions due to COVID-19 and difficulties understanding why the rules and restrictions are important are significant predictors of academic well-being. We see teachers that succeed with this by, for instance, guiding the pupils carefully in managing the regulations, and by helping the pupils to develop a language about it that suits their age. Furthermore, I suggest focusing on pupils' perceived coping. We know that repeated experiences of lack of perceived coping can lead to declines in the pupils' self-efficacy, which will further affect their educational achievements. Thus, the attention to the pupils' perceived coping is not only relevant for the well-being during the reopening, but also in relation to the future educational opportunities. Structural changes such as the increase in outdoor activities and the division into smaller social groups do not seem actually to have any direct effect on either the three dimensions of social emotional experiences or perceived coping. This is interesting actually, since these factors have been recurrent themes when it, in a Danish context, has been discussed politically and in the media, what we can learn from the whole situation with COVID-19 teaching. Thank you for listening, and thanks again for inviting me to do this talk. And you're welcome to write to me if you have any questions or want to hear more about the project.
Thank you, Ana, and thanks once again to both of our speakers. This is our virtual round of applause for you, which we're just going to imagine is happening right now. I'm sure all of our attendees are very grateful for these really in-depth presentations about play during the pandemic. I'm going to try and pick out a few questions from the Q&A. For everyone who's attending, please feel free to use the function at the bottom of your screen to type a question, and although we may not be able to answer all of them in the remaining 10 minutes, we will try to touch on as many as we can. The first question I'd like to ask both of our speakers is whether you know of any resources or tools that parents can use, maybe even for teachers as well, to help them support free play.
Do you want me to go first? So there are a lot of resources actually available online. So the play organisations, Play England, Play Wales, Play Scotland and Play Board Northern Ireland have all produced lots of resources to support parents and schools thinking about how to support children's free play, how to support play when children return back to school, learning through landscapes as well. I've got some good advice on their website about how you can keep your equipment clean and things like that if you want children to be playing in school and using equipment. So those, I would look up those organisations. They offer lots of advice generally, but during the pandemic they've done specific guides and things around play during the pandemic. Yeah,
I can continue. I do not actually know a lot about the resources for doing play during the coronavirus, but I think that one of the important things that we've learned from our study is that being able to utilize the new conditions during the pandemic, for instance, as I said, that utilize the small groups in order to do something special with them, or utilize the outdoor activities in order to engage with the nature, to go for walks and so on, instead of just doing what you're used to do in normal settings outside in the new context. That would be my advice for organizing play.
Thanks to you both. More generally, I wonder if you had anything to say specifically about some of the benefits that might have come out of these unusual circumstances, any lessons that we can take forward. I noticed, for instance, in Anna, in your findings, you mentioned that some children appreciated having smaller groups. You called them zones. I think in the UK they call them bubbles. But this idea that social interaction was constrained, for some children that felt like a positive thing. But just more generally, is there anything that we can take forward from these circumstances?
Yeah, I think that we need to be careful not to generalize too much from the closures, because this is an extremely ordinary situation with the children doing a job and going into this as a project, and maybe this is hard to generalize to other settings. But of course, we should learn something from the way we organize our learning environments. And one of the things that you mentioned was that the small groups actually, or the zoning in Denmark, actually help the kids to engage with their class community and to strengthen this. We actually see in the study that a lot of the kids say that they feel a better learning community in the class than before the COVID-19. Still, I have to say that the smallest kids get most from the zoning and the small groups than the older ones. The older kids actually say that they feel that they miss kids from other classes or from other zones than they're used to. But we also see that they actually get to engage with this problem. We see that they send each other letters or engage on a digital media and so on. So I think we can learn a lot from the way kids actually handle this situation and find solutions to engage with that, but also about how when we in this situation actually I pointed at this point that the children need to know why the rules and restrictions are important, and I think we could also, and that actually affects their social emotional experiences a lot. And I think we can learn from engaging the kids in the things we do and explaining why things have to be done in certain ways and so on. So there's a lot of stuff we can take from the studies, and I'm very happy to be able to follow the kids during these phases of transformation, because I actually think that we can learn a lot, but also that we will see differences over time.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, just to add to that. So I'm always a little bit cautious about talking about kind of positives that have come out of this, because I'm very conscious that there are some people for whom this has been really, really very difficult time and very challenging for some children. But I think from my perspective, things that I've noticed, so one is very much in support of what Anna was saying, that when children did go back to school and they were in these small groups, lots of parents reporting that they're loving school more than they ever have before, they're happier to go than they've ever been before, and really seeing those benefits of being in smaller groups. And I think as well in terms of families, I think a lot of people maybe have realised that they don't need to keep their children busy the whole time, you know, so all of the activities that children would normally be doing, and they'd be at school and they might go somewhere after school and go do some sports, might be an after school club, and you know, lots of children live quite scheduled lives. And I think what parents realised was that if they allow them to just go and play, often they'll go for hours and they'll make up a game and they'll play and they'll entertain themselves. And that feeling of kind of needing to do the whole time, let's go somewhere, let's do something, let's, you know, I think to some extent maybe that has changed a little bit. Whether we hold on to that and remember that, or whether we just revert back to how we used to live, is yet to be seen. But I think certainly for some families there might be some benefit in that as well.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for 2 more questions if you're willing to be very concise. The first one that I'd like to bring out, a few people have asked about how families with different types of situations, different circumstances, different social or economic conditions, how this has affected those families differently. Is that something that your work has looked at?
Yeah, I have, and I did a study during the closure with focusing on also of the differences across different groups of kids, and actually the differences were larger during the closure than after the reopening, and that's as they said at home. Some of them had not the digital environment that were necessary in order to deal with the other kids or with the teaching context in from home. So I think that the differences were greater during the closure than during the reopening when you look at the school context.
Yeah, and I think similarly what we've seen is that the lockdown and the pandemic has increased inequality. You know, so some children, you know, in the survey that I talked about, children are spending more time playing outside. Lots of families, you know, we enjoy our family bike rides every day now, and that's not what lockdown looked like for a lot of families, and we mustn't forget that. Particularly, you know, if we're basing our findings on surveys where we don't necessarily have a good representation of all demographic groups. I think, you know, children who haven't had access to technology, haven't been able to keep up with schoolwork, haven't been able to connect with friends. For them, it's been particularly challenging. So I think certainly it's not the case that there's been consistent experiences across children. And if anything, the pandemic's probably widening existing inequalities.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask a final question on behalf of our attendees, and I'd also like to give a heads up to everybody that we'll be sending out some questions for you to answer, very brief questions, a bit of feedback about our webinars in case we're able to organize some more. It would be nice to know about your experiences. So the last question is a very practical question. This one is keeping teachers in mind. Given everything that we've seen and said so far today, can you offer any advice for teachers who are now in the positions that they are in? How can they resist this pressure of going back to a big focus on academics at the expense of play? What would you recommend to teachers?
Let's go first. I think it's really hard for teachers without some guidance from above, so to speak, that that's what they should be doing. If they're under a lot of pressure to get children caught up, then it's really tricky. But I think that the argument that I would make is that if you want children to do well academically, then they need to be in the best position that they can be socially and emotionally. And I think, Anna, your data speaks to that. So if what we need to do first to get children ready to learn effectively is give them time to play and prioritise their social and emotional well-being, ultimately that will mean that they are in a better place and better able to catch up if that's the goal. So, and I think that argument is fairly robust, that, you know, where children will be in a year will be better if we give them the time and the space that they need now. Anna?
Yeah, and I agree totally. I think that we have to be aware that social and emotional well-being is a prerequisite for academic well-being, or for working with the academic part. Still, I have to say that I understand if teachers are eager to go back and do some of the schoolwork, both because they're actually in themselves afraid that they will not keep the standards, but also because actually in our study we see that the kids ask for it. They actually want to go back and engage with the school activities. And so my advice would be to try to incorporate some of the teaching activities within a playful learning environment. And that's what I actually suggested during the talk, that to say that we can actually do learning activities with the inquiry-based teaching activities where they go to a lake and investigate the fishes and the greens and so on, or when they go to somewhere else. So engage the kids in a social context and with the focus on how they can create meaning, engage with the activities, engage with the subjects within an environment where the time to flow during the day, but also time to engage with each other in these social groups. So maybe try to incorporate or not talking of play as something that is totally different from engaging with the content of school.
Thank you. Excellent note to finish on. Thank you to both of our speakers. I would like to finish this third webinar in our series by thanking Ana Qvortrup, who's done an amazing amount of work to organize these, and also all of our attendees. A reminder that these are viewable online, and please continue to reach out to PEDAL, and hopefully we can all continue to play together. Thank you.